It was the kind of quiet that does not merely lack sound, but actively devours it. A deafening white stillness that blankets the vast, unforgiving landscape of the Canadian high Arctic. For 30 years, this silence had held the secret of the Ethelred expedition. They were 9 souls, men and women drawn from the elite echelons of polar science and mountaineering, unified by a single audacious goal: to establish a long-term research outpost deep within the glacial heart of Ellesmere Island, far north of any established settlement. The year was 1987, a time when ambition still outpaced technology, when the final frontier of the world remained, stubbornly, the icy wastes. Their mission was vital: a 4-year commitment to ice core drilling and meteorological analysis, and they had prepared for it with a meticulousness bordering on the religious. They left behind detailed logs, contingency plans for every imaginable disaster, and a promise to check in via satellite phone every Sunday at 18 years Zulu. But the Arctic, as it always does, harbored the unimaginable. The first hint of disaster was not a distress call, but the profound absence of one. On the second Sunday of October 1987, the 18 Zulu window opened and closed, leaving only static on the airwaves. This was unusual, certainly, but not yet cause for alarm. Sunspots, equipment failure, or even a simple logistical error could explain the lapse. It was the next week's silence that cast the first pall of true dread. A seasoned team led by Dr. Alistair Finch did not miss 2 check-ins. It was an act of non-communication that defied the very nature of their professionalism. The authorities waited another 48 hours, clinging to the thin thread of hope that a ferocious, localized blizzard had merely prevented them from deploying the antenna. But when the 3rd Sunday passed in that same echoing void, the search operation was initiated. A massive, urgent deployment of air and ice resources that stretched the capacities of 3 nations. The initial assumption, the most rational one in such a desolate environment, was a catastrophic failure, a fuel explosion, a structural collapse, or, most likely, a forced retreat into the cold that had ended in swift and mass hypothermia. The search teams were not looking for survivors. They were looking for a body of evidence, a final tragic scene. The irony of the search was its futility. They scoured the landscape for 3 months, their helicopters crisscrossing the grids established around the Ethelred's reported location. They flew low over the moraines and high above the vast, slow-moving glaciers. The 9 explorers, along with their prefabricated research habitat, had simply evaporated. The sheer scale of the Arctic wilderness works not just to kill, but to conceal. It is a monumental canvas of white that can absorb a small base and 9 human beings without leaving a trace. No telltale antenna jutting from a snowdrift, no slick of oil. On the ice, no fragmented radio mast. The investigators, themselves men and women accustomed to the stoicism required by such harsh work, felt the psychological weight of this emptiness. They were hunting ghosts in a place that had no history of its own, only the crushing, endless present of ice and rock. The official report, filed in the spring of 1988, concluded with a dreadful finality that the Ethelred expedition had succumbed to an unknown polar event, possibly an unprecedented storm or an avalanche of ice, and that the remains were irrevocably lost to the elements. The case was closed. The missing explorers added to the solemn, growing ledger of those claimed by the high latitudes, their fate sealed by a signature on a government document. Yet, as with all great mysteries, the official record offered no peace, only a profound and lasting sense of injustice that lingered with the families and the few haunted members of the initial search party. They knew, in the core of their professional being, that the vanishing was too clean, too absolute, and that somewhere out there, the truth remained entombed. The Arctic had simply folded its arms around its secret and refused to surrender. For 3 decades, the tragedy of the Ethelred 9 became a whisper in the annals of polar exploration, a cautionary tale reserved for new recruits, a narrative that faded into grainy archival photos of smiling, hopeful faces bundled against a cold that would eventually consume them. The families, consumed by a grief that offered no site for pilgrimage, fought for sporadic, small-scale reinvestigations. But the vast financial and logistical hurdle of the high Arctic always proved insurmountable. The landscape itself became a metaphor for their loss, cold, immense, and ultimately unknowable. The prevailing assumption was that the base, the entire 20-ton structure, had been crushed and buried beneath the relentless weight of a migrating glacier, ground into the moraine, its debris scattered over a span of miles, a needle in a continent-sized haystack of ice. This theory, while grim, at least provided a logical, natural explanation. The explorers were victims of geology, not some sinister, unclassified horror. This became the accepted, if emotionally unsatisfactory, truth. Then, 30 years after the final radio silence, the landscape itself began to speak. The year was 2017, and a satellite imaging mission, a purely scientific venture focused on mapping the recession rates of the vast ice sheets on Ellesmere Island, captured an anomaly. It was a perfect, unblemished quadrilateral shape, rendered in an unnaturally dark metallic hue against the blinding white of the glacial surface. At first, the analysts dismissed it as a digital artifact, a sensor glitch, but subsequent high-resolution passes confirmed the shape's unnerving permanence. It was approximately 60 feet long and 20 feet wide, far too large and too geometric to be a natural formation. Furthermore, it was located precisely on the coordinates that Dr. Finch had provided as his final intended base location in 1987. The base had not been ground down, it had been preserved. It lay not in the crushing heart of the glacier, but at its periphery, having been slowly, gently exhumed by a 3-decade cycle of melt and freeze, now exposed by a rapidly receding sheet of permanent ice. The discovery immediately shattered the fragile peace the families had constructed around the tragedy. The Ethelred's habitat was designated Alpha Site 4, and the new expedition, funded by a sudden rush of governmental and private interest, was mounted with unprecedented speed. The team, a blend of polar archaeologists, forensic specialists, and veteran SAR operators, knew they were not merely investigating a historical cold case. They were penetrating a 30-year-old crime scene, perfectly preserved by nature's own refrigeration. The physical base, when they finally landed beside it, was a sight of astonishing, heartbreaking clarity. The habitat, a prefabricated composite structure, was not crushed. It was merely sealed. A thick, opaque layer of frozen meltwater had encased it entirely, rendering the original entrances inaccessible. The structure sat like a sarcophagus in the ice, a frozen tomb holding the final truth of the 9 lives within. The investigative team stared at the surface, which showed no evidence of struggle, no frantic attempt to exit. The external satellite antenna was neatly folded and secured to the roof, indicating they had finished their radio work before whatever happened began. The decision was made to use thermal lances to cut a controlled access point into the main dome. The process was slow, measured, and permeated by a profound sense of gravity. Every foot of ice melted away, felt like the turning of a page in a diary, long thought lost. As the team cut the final few inches, the air grew thick with a mix of anticipation and dread. The temperature differential between the sterile, 21st century air of the Arctic day and the 30-year-old atmosphere of the habitat promised to be a shock. The men and women masked against potential biohazards understood the moment's significance. They were the first witnesses to a scene prepared in 1987. And they had assumed a violent end, a dramatic catastrophe that had scattered the evidence. But the pristine, sealed nature of the base suggested something far more unsettling. If the catastrophe was not external and sudden, then it must have been internal. A slow burn horror that had driven the 9 experienced explorers to a silent, collective end inside their own fortress of survival. The truth, they realized with a cold, rising certainty, was waiting just beyond the thin sheet of ice. The thermal lance breached the composite shell with a hiss of superheated steam, and the resulting cold air that rushed out carried no discernible scent, only the sterile, deep cold of a sub-zero vacuum. The team leader, a stoic forensic pathologist named Dr. Anya Volkov, was the first to enter the base through the carefully cut aperture. What she found immediately and fundamentally defied every working theory established over the prior 30 years. There was no chaos. There was no frantic mess indicative of a struggle, a fire, or a breach. The interior of Alpha Site 4 was frozen, certainly, but it was also meticulously organized, a snapshot of life interrupted, not life violently ended. Food stores were secured, tools were hung neatly on pegboards, and the bedding in the 9 small bunks was folded with an almost military precision. The central work table held 3 open notebooks and a neatly arranged stack of meteorological charts. The scene was one of startling, almost domestic tranquility. Initial assumptions that a gas leak had incapacitated them, that a sudden pressure drop had killed them in their sleep, were instantly shattered by the evidence of conscious, deliberate action. Experienced explorers, falling unconscious, do not fold their blankets and secure their equipment. They flee, they struggle, or they die where they stand. But the 9 members of the Ethelred expedition had done none of these things. They had, it seemed, prepared for their final moments with a collective, unsettling composure. This discovery introduced a new, darker line of inquiry. Not what catastrophe befell them, but what decision they made in the face of it. Where were the bodies? The search of the habitat was painstaking, a slow, methodical catalog of mundane objects frozen in time. The medical bay was intact, holding a surprising amount of pharmaceutical supplies. The kitchen area still contained the remnants of a meal, 9 plates, each with a small portion of dehydrated pasta, all left unfinished, as if the explorers had suddenly, unanimously, chosen to walk away from the table. It was in the communication and logistics module that the first truly unsettling pieces of evidence were found. The satellite phone was in its cradle, fully charged, its emergency beacon disabled. This single fact stood as a monumental challenge to the official record. They had not been unable to call for help. They had chosen not to. But why? To disable the beacon, a 3-step manual process, indicated not a panic, but a chilling intent. Next to the phone, on a small shelf, sat a collection of personal items that had been purposefully placed there. 9 objects, one for each member, neatly lined up like offerings. There was a rusted silver pendant belonging to the geologist, a worn copy of the Odyssey owned by the chief engineer, and a small antique wooden carving of a raven that belonged to Dr. Finch. They were not items one would grab in a desperate escape. They were mementos left for the inevitable discovery. This was not a campsite abandonment. It was a voluntary ritualistic departure. The greatest shock, however, was in the attached storage unit. The unit was designed to hold the heavy-duty snowmobiles and the external survival gear. Every piece of equipment designed for long-distance travel in extreme cold. The expedition-grade tents, the high-altitude parkas, the fuel reserve tanks, the heavy-duty snowshoes, was present and accounted for. Not a single snowmobile was missing. They stood in their places, batteries disconnected for the long storage. The 9 explorers had left their perfectly preserved, secure habitat, not to escape, but to walk into the white oblivion. Without their primary means of transportation or their most essential survival gear. This profound abandonment of all survival logic was the central incomprehensible mystery of the Ethelred 9. It begged the rhetorical question that hung like the frost in the air. What force could compel 9 highly rational individuals to leave a fully stocked fortress, disable their last link to the outside world, and walk into the Arctic night equipped with nothing but the clothes on their backs? The investigators, now entrenched in the perfectly preserved 30-year-old environment of Alpha Site 4, began the painstaking process of forensic analysis. The physical evidence had proven less about how the explorers died and more about why they chose their fate. The primary focus shifted to the handwritten logbooks found on the central table. The entries, written primarily by Dr. Finch, were detailed, factual records of weather, ice conditions, and scientific progress, continuing the linear, chronological narrative of the expedition. They documented the routine of life in the base, the minor tensions, the small celebrations. For the first 2 years of the expected 4-year tour, the narrative was entirely consistent with a successful professional expedition. The discovery, however, lay in the final pages. The date on the last entry was October 10th, 1987, a full week before the first missed check-in. The handwriting had degraded dramatically, shifting from the neat, scientific script to a frantic, scrawling testament of dread. Dr. Finch's final words, read aloud in the frigid silence of the habitat, were not a scientific observation, but a confession of emotional terror. The text, filling 2 final densely packed pages, spoke not of storms or equipment failure, but of something outside the base, an incessant, rhythmic pressure against the composite walls that defied classification. He wrote of the silence growing deeper, not outside but inside the structure, as if the sound had been drawn out of the air. He documented a creeping psychological certainty among the 9 that they were no longer alone, despite the blank horizon. Crucially, the entry described a shift in their own collective state. They ceased talking to each other, communicating only through written notes, a strange, enforced silence that permeated their last week. The log concluded with the chillingly declarative statement, "We must leave the source behind. The purity of the outside is the only remaining option." This single baffling sentence became the new foundation for the dark line of inquiry. The investigators searched the structure again, this time not for signs of a break-in, but for the source mentioned in the log. And they found a third unsettling detail, this one purely physical and mechanical. In a small utility cupboard, they located the base's internal communications array. It was a sophisticated closed-loop network designed to keep the 9 team members in constant voice contact across the structure's various modules. The wiring harness, a thick, reinforced cable bundle, had been meticulously cut in 9 different places, one for each explorer. The cuts were not made by a frantic slash of a knife, but by a precision instrument, each severance clean and deliberate. The explorers had systematically blinded and deafened themselves inside their own secure habitat. This confirmed the enforced silence noted in the log, suggesting a terrifying consensus that hearing was the key to their destruction, that the very act of speech or reception was a danger. The true significance of their departure was now revealed. They had not been trying to escape to safety, but to escape from the base, fleeing a growing threat that the structure itself had somehow amplified or contained. The final horrifying discovery was made in the very center of the habitat, directly beneath where the central work table had been positioned. Dr. Volkoff noticed a minuscule, almost invisible anomaly in the floor paneling. A faint, circular scratch pattern that was not consistent with normal foot traffic. When the panel was carefully removed, the team discovered a shallow, circular depression carved directly into the composite subflooring, exactly 20 centimeters in diameter. It was not a crack. It was a deliberate, scooped-out hollow. And inside this hollow they found the 9th, final object, a small, intricately carved wooden box, no larger than a deck of cards, containing nothing but a fine, black, metallic dust that defied analysis. It was this dust, this small, strange, physical presence in the heart of their sanctuary, that the Ethelred 9 had fled, sealing their fate to avoid the source of a terror no less real for its utter lack of physical violence. The accumulated evidence forced the investigators to abandon all conventional explanations and face the horrific certainty that the Ethelred 9 had been consumed by a force beyond mere survival logic, a terror unique to the polar isolation. The absence of the bodies was, in its own way, the final piece of the puzzle. They had not been killed in the base. They had left it to die. The consensus of the forensic team, synthesizing the log, the disabled beacon, and the strange artifacts, coalesced around a theory of induced psychological distress, a shared delirium triggered by an environmental or sensory event that warped their reality. Was it infrasound generated by the vast shifting ice sheets, bombarding their minds with low-frequency waves that induce panic and irrationality? Was it a localized, extreme manifestation of the Earth's magnetic field, causing a collective severe psychosis? The precision with which they prepared for their demise, folding the beds, disabling the comms, lining up the mementos, suggested a shared ritualistic response to an agreed-upon internal imperative. They were not crazy. They were decisive. The base, their only chance for survival, had become their prison, and the frigid, desolate white expanse had become, in their final moments of clarity, their escape route. Their final steps, tracing the path from the sealed habitat, were entirely consistent with the physical effort of 9 individuals walking purposefully downhill toward the relative shelter of a distant moraine, a desperate march in only their second layer of clothing, without supplies. They had chosen to die in the open rather than remain contaminated by the source within the structure. This was the final tragic contrast. The youthful joy of their initial ambition, set against the unimaginable dread that led them to embrace the most brutal form of death the planet offers, exposure in the polar night, as the lesser of two evils. They had walked 1.5 miles before the inevitable, crushing cold claimed them, their tracks quickly erased by the perennial sweep of the Arctic wind. They had become one with the silence they had sought to study. The recovery of the bodies, a task left to a later specialized expedition, was always going to be the final somber act. The glacial cycle, which had so kindly preserved the base, had in the intervening months begun to slowly reveal the scattered remnants of the 9 explorers along the melt line of the moraine, precisely where they had been predicted to have collapsed. The bodies, mummified by the extreme cold, told a final, heartbreaking story of desperation, not violence. 6 had succumbed to hypothermia, their internal organs shutting down in a slow, brutal surrender. But 3 of the bodies, consistent with the unsettling pattern of other infamous mysteries of the desolate places, revealed something more. Not violent trauma, but inexplicable, non-fatal injuries sustained in the final hours. Fractured ribs, minor but deep skull cracks, all consistent with a desperate self-inflicted need for physical pain to break the psychological terror. Or perhaps a mutual non-malicious attempt to subdue one another in a final confused frenzy. The true horror was that these 3 had not died from these injuries. They had died from the cold, just like the others, succumbing to the exposure they had so deliberately sought. The official conclusion, rewritten now for the second time, finally acknowledged the environmental psychosis, the mass-shared delusion. But the deeper mystery remained forever tied to the small, circular hollow in the floor and the black inert dust it contained. Was it a chemical contaminant? A unique atmospheric irritant? 30 years later, with the evidence recovered and catalogued, the story of the Ethelred 9 remains a haunting testament to the power of the empty place to turn an interior sanctuary into a psychological hell. The base, their fortress, had failed them not structurally but philosophically, turning against the rational mind. The vast silence of the Arctic was not just a lack of sound, it was the raw, primordial state of the world, and for the 9 explorers it had finally, irrevocably spoken. And its words were a command. Leave. The ultimate justice, or perhaps the ultimate injustice, was that the frozen base, the symbol of their failure and their tomb, would now stand as a permanent, chilling monument to the terror that lay dormant in the heart of the world, a question mark etched into the eternal ice. The legacy of the Ethelred expedition is the chilling certainty that even the most meticulous preparation cannot account for the abyss that opens when the mind is stripped of its sensory anchors. The investigators returned from Alpha Site 4 with their evidence, but they carried back a profound psychological toll, a sense of having briefly touched the raw nerve of the Arctic. The base, now carefully secured and monitored, sits silently on the edge of the glacier, a perfectly preserved, 60-foot-long time capsule of dread. The neatly folded blankets, the unfinished plates, the 9 purposefully disabled communication lines, they all speak of a collective, horrifying choice made in the last moments of rational thought. The black dust, the alleged source of the contamination, was analyzed exhaustively, yielding no known toxic compound, only a unique combination of magnetic ferrous particles and trace organic matter that offered no definitive conclusion. The physical evidence offered authority, but no closure. The 9 artifacts left on the shelf, the raven carving, the rusted pendant, became the symbolic focus of the tragedy, representing the 9 souls who, in their final moments, had stripped themselves down to their essential selves before walking into the white. The repetition of the number 9 from the 9 explorers to the 9 cut communication cables and the 9 unfinished plates underscores a final unnerving synchronicity, a collective act of surrender to the unknown imperative. It was not a chaotic panic. It was a devastating shared clarity. The vastness of the landscape, the key theme of the initial inquiry, was now understood not as the obstacle to finding them, but as the final stage of their escape. They did not flee the Arctic. They embraced it as the ultimate cleanser, the final antidote to the poison within the base. The contrast between the clinical perfection of the base's interior and the raw, unreasoning desperation of their final walk remains the most disturbing aspect of the case. 30 years had transformed a missing persons case into an existential warning. The story of the 9 explorers became a modern allegory for the fragile boundary between sanity and the profound, oppressive solitude of the deep wilderness. They were the victims of their own success, trapped not by the failure of their equipment, but by the overwhelming sensory vacuum they had sought to conquer. Their meticulously built structure had become a crucible for a psychological experiment no one had intended to run. The rhythmic, unnatural pressure Dr. Finch noted in his log, was it the grinding of the glacier itself, a sound amplified and distorted into a weapon by the structure's acoustics? Was it the sound of their own heartbeats, magnified in the overwhelming silence until they sounded like an approaching entity? The questions, like the cold, have a way of lingering. The discovery of the base under the ice was not the end of the mystery. It was merely the opening of the final closed loop. The horrific certainty is that the Ethelred 9 died not from a failure to survive, but yet from a calculated, deliberate act of self-exile. They were not murdered and they were not killed by a random accident. They were pursued by something unseen, something the base had captured, and they chose the purity of the desolate white as their final sanctuary. The entire structure, an achievement of human engineering, now serves only to house the ghost of an unclassified internal dread. And as the warming climate continues to peel back the ice sheets, revealing more of the planet's buried secrets, one cannot help but reflect on the ultimate rhetorical question left by the Ethelred 9. If a place can be so devoid of life, so pristine and overwhelming, does it not eventually begin to create its own new and terrifying life? The silence on Ellesmere Island remains, but now it is heavier, burdened by the knowledge of what it can conceal and what it can compel.